Aloha and welcome to an Introduction to Japanese. This presentation aims to provide a foundation for your Japanese language learning career. In it, we'll discuss Japanese society and culture in addition to the Japanese language, highlighting basic but core concepts for understanding the society, culture, and language, and how they all interact. These concepts will be of great use as you begin your studies and as you level up over time. First, why even learn Japanese? Of course, there are many reasons, including Japan's economic power, Japan's scientific and technological power, as well as Japan's strong alliance and partnership with the US. In addition, you have Japan's global cultural and business power, and while it has benefits for getting into college, for those already in college, it has many benefits for post-graduation employability and earnings. One other big reason to learn Japanese is that it allows you to access and learn much more and at a deeper level about the fascinating country that is Japan. Of course, there are many, many more reasons and benefits, which you'll likely discover on your own on your Japanese language learning journey. With an eye on the characteristics of Japanese, this presentation will focus on the following topics: social and cultural relationships, organization and grammar, writing systems, pronunciation, and lastly, the pyramid, which will make more sense when we get to it. On the topic of social and cultural relationships, social awareness and consideration of others is immensely important. These notions emerge in many ways, with three particularly important ones. First, space and place, be they public or private. Japanese speakers must be very aware of the spaces and places they are in, as it will have a strong influence on their behavior and language use. Second, service and respect, from business encounters to personal encounters. In Japan, high value is placed on being of use to others and showing others courtesy and politeness. Third, gratitude and apology. Compared to American culture, Japanese culture differs somewhat in when and how to express gratitude and apology. In addition to acts, for instance, Japanese speakers are usually more sensitive to indebtedness and intrusions, bothers, inconveniences, and burdens. Group affiliation is also an important concept. At the heart of this concept are the terms uchi, inside, and soto, outside. Who the in-group is and who the out-groupers are depends on a specific context, situation, or perspective. It may be along lines of country, region, or family, school, club, or workplace. As situations and contexts shift, so too do the boundaries. It's fluid. In one instance, a person may move from one group to the other. High context sensitivity. What context sensitivity refers to is to what degree contextual aspects are encoded, explicitly present in the written or spoken language. On one hand, English has low context sensitivity. While it has word choice, tone, and demeanor, for instance, many contextual aspects are implicit, implied, or not explicitly referenced at all. On the other hand, Japanese has high context sensitivity, a broad array of contextual aspects that are overly explicitly encoded in the language. Broadly, they include situational aspects, relationships, and interactional aspects. Specifically, for instance, where the conversation is being held, what is being talked about, who you're talking to, differences in style, one's actions or perspective, etc. All are encoded somehow, whether via conversational or sentence patterns, words, conjugations, particles, nuances, and tone. As an English speaker learning Japanese, this is one of the harder things to grasp and apply, as you now have to be more consciously aware of an array of contextual aspects and account for them in the language you produce. It takes time, but gradually your mind will adapt to being sensitive to more contexts and indicating them appropriately. Style and formality are also crucial to master. One of the aforementioned contextual aspects you have to be aware of is who you are interacting and talking with, and thus what style to use. The general social hierarchy has those with power in a given situation at the top, then status, and lastly age. So, depending on a given situation and the individual's relationship, they may use differing styles of language. Whether slang, close casual, distant formal, humble, or honorific. In each style, language use will differ to varying degrees. For instance, to eat would be said as either ku, taberu, tabemasu, o tabeshimasu, or meshiagarimasu. Spoken language and written language is another important topic and distinction to keep in mind as you learn. In Japanese, while there is a lot of overlap between the spoken and written systems, there's also a lot of very different, separate features, including style, grammatical forms and conjugations, vocab usage, phrases, and expressions. It can be a challenge to learn the features of one medium, let alone two, and it can also be tricky to learn when it is possible to cross over between the two. But the more you learn, the more you'll come to recognize the underlying patterns. Lastly, norms and variations, or in other words, defaults and deviations. When speaking of Japanese, perhaps the most commonly thought of norm is that Japanese people are reserved, indirect, and implicitly infer a lot or are incomplete in their speech. While this may indeed be so in many circumstances and for many speakers, what we're really talking about here is whether it's the spoken mode or written mode, or a certain context, situation, or activity, or a certain style, formality, there are implicit norms and defaults, expected standard language and features, such as sentence phrase structure, expressions utterances, word choices, conjugations, tone, and listener responses. As a baseline, it's important to learn these norms. Once you know them, you'll also come to know the variations and deviations, including each's nuance, implication, and possible consequence. Once you know the whole picture, then the choice of norm versus variation is up to you. You just have to keep in mind the possible benefits or consequences of each choice. Now, onto the topic of organization and grammar. When thinking about Japanese in terms of its organization and grammar, it's essential to know and keep in mind that things occur at both the sentence level and the conversation level. In other words, if you focus on only the sentence level, there are times when you won't be able to understand why certain things are organized or done a certain way, or why certain grammar is used a certain way. Because a lot of Japanese language practices and features only function at the discourse conversational level. In Japanese 101, you'll encounter a couple such cases. For example, in Japanese conversation, once something is mentioned and or understood, it's usually not repeated in subsequent utterances and sentences. So if you're focusing on the subsequent part and only thinking at the sentence level, the fact that something's missing will throw you off. But if you think at the conversational level, it will be clear why it's not there anymore. Another example is particles wa versus ga. While seemingly simple, each's use is multifaceted, and you'll be learning when to use each and their differences and nuances for quite a long while. At the core of it, though, if you're only looking at a sentence level, they will seem quite similar and interchangeable. But in actuality, wa is more of a conversation, bigger level particle, and ga is more of a sentence, small level particle. In sum, as you learn Japanese, if you keep a broader mind and consider sentence as well as conversation, it'll be much easier to grasp a variety of language practices and features. Next is sentence structure, particularly the difference between English and Japanese. With English, as you'll intuitively know, a sentence is organized subject, verb, object. For example, yesterday, I watched a movie. There's a time phrase, then the subject, I, and the action, watched a movie. The focus is on the subject and their action. With Japanese, a sentence is organized topic, above, and then subject, object, verb, all in brackets, as I'll explain shortly. So, yesterday, I, movie, watched, with yesterday in the topic position. Japanese uniquely has this topic in a higher position, something like a cloud that hovers over and frames the rest of the sentence, or sentences. So the topic here, yesterday, stays the same, floating above, even as I add more sentences. For instance, going into details of the movie, perhaps other activities I did on that day. As I go on, however, the topic, yesterday, has already been mentioned and is understood, and it is thus not likely to be repeated in my further sentences, hence the brackets, a part that may not be there, given prior talk and understanding. So, while English usually requires everything in every sentence, in Japanese, just about any part can be omitted. So, as another example, when you, the subject, are understood, you don't have to keep saying it in every sentence. I did this, I did that, I. you can, and normally do, leave it out and focus on the content. Overall, Japanese sentence organization is more of a topic and comment structure, which emphasizes a topic and a description occurrence, de-emphasizing the individual, and which also allows for omission of understood elements. In Japanese, there are 4 foundational patterns, which you'll gradually get to over your first semester. E wa be desu, E wa be verb, which technically includes the above because des is technically the verb to be. E wa be ni aru. And lastly, E wa be ga si. Once you know these foundation patterns, you'll be able to recognize how everything else is just an expansion of one or a connection of them. Within the Japanese sentence, there is another major difference from English: the marking of function or role. This applies to nouns and their function or role in the sentence, whether as the topic, subject, time, place, object, etc. In English, marking of a noun's function role is covert, implicit. There is nothing explicitly added to the noun. Instead, we understand its function and role based mostly on word order, but also what words are there and what makes the most sense. For example, in the sentence, I ate sushi, we know I is the subject because in English the subject goes towards the start and right before the verb. Similarly, we know sushi is the object because it follows the verb, and also because given the other words I and ate, it makes sense as the object. In Japanese, marking of a noun's function and role is overt, explicit, meaning after each noun, we attach a specific particle which indicates that noun's function or role in the sentence. This can be very tricky for English speakers who usually follow the rhythm of set word orders and don't really think explicitly about each noun's function or role. In other words, as you form Japanese sentences, you have to clearly think about and mark each and every noun as you go. A big benefit of this, however, is that the noun-particle combo forms a unit, which we can then move around the sentence. Since the noun has an attached particle, no matter where we put it, its meaning will be clear. While Japanese sentences do have a default order for these units and other elements, they can easily shuffle around. For instance, moving a unit to the front of the sentence to emphasize it. It adds more functionality and use to a sentence, but can also be somewhat tricky for English speakers, as you'll have to get used to seeing, hearing, and using various orders within a sentence. Japanese also differs when it comes to conjugations. In English, we use a verb stem with suffixes, such as I work, and in past tense adding ed, I worked. But there are often irregularities, such as I go, but in past tense changing completely to I went. Or for ongoing actions, we have to add a word am and ing. I am working, I am going. This is all just for verbs. When we have adjectives, we have a stem plus other words. It is hot, it was hot, it will be hot. In all, English conjugations have a host of configurations for verbs alone and for adjectives, and there are a lot of irregularities throughout. In Japanese, everything, verbs, adjectives, and nouns, have a stem, followed by appropriate conjugations. It's much more organized with a core meaning followed by nuances. It can be tricky, however, as most of the meaning is encoded in these dense conjugations, which can be complex, layer upon each other, and reflect different styles. In this way, the Japanese sentence ending, where all conjugations come, is arguably the most difficult part of the sentence. 3 main considerations when dealing with these conjugations are form, style, whether short forms, close style, or long forms, distant style, tense, whether past, complete, or habitual, future, incomplete, and polarity, whether positive or negative. In other words, whether you did or didn't do something. These 3 are the core considerations, but as you move up in your Japanese level, you'll learn more meanings and nuances, and thus more conjugational considerations to work in. As you learn Japanese organization and grammar, however, one thing to keep in mind is that grammar is a stepping stone to meaning. In language, each clause, phrase, and sentence is there not for the grammar itself, but to convey meaning, and negotiate meaning between people. In other words, grammar is not the focus. Meaning is. You first need to know what you want to say, what you're aiming to say. It is with that that we then draw on resources, including appropriate grammar, to do so. Now, moving on, let's briefly talk about the Japanese writing systems. Japanese has three. First, hiragana, which is typically used for native words and expressions, particles, and conjugations. Second, katakana, which is typically used for foreign loanwords, foreign names, for instance of people and places, and scientific terms. Third, kanji, which is typically used for nouns, including compound words, and verb and adjective stems. As you can see, hiragana is characterized as being more curvy and fluid, and katakana as being more sharp and rigid. Yet, interestingly, both of these scripts were derived from kanji, albeit in different ways. Many ages ago, when Japan and Japanese had no writing system, kanji were brought from China and adopted at several different points throughout history. Hence, kanji means Chinese characters. Kanji are divided into four categories. First, pictographs, characters that are pictorial symbols depicting the visual shape of what they refer to. For instance, the first character, for mountain, represents 3 peaks, and the second, for river, flowing currents of water. Second, ideographs, characters that symbolize an idea. For instance, the first character, which was originally a line with a dot above it, represents the idea of above, whereas the second character, which was originally a line with a dot below it, represents the idea of below. Third, semantic compounds, characters which combine the meanings of its constituent parts to form a synergetic meaning. The character here, for instance, is a combination of the characters for sun and moon, with the full character meaning bright. Fourth, semantic phonetic compounds, which make up the large majority of kanji characters in Japanese. These characters have a meaning part and a reading pronunciation part. The meaning part, or the radical, identifies the general category of meaning to which the word belongs. The reading pronunciation part, while technically having a meaning of its own and helping to form the whole character, mainly identifies the reading pronunciation of the whole character. When it comes to readings, a single kanji character typically has multiple pronunciations, which belong to one of 2 types. One type is kunyomi, the native Japanese pronunciations. In other words, a native Japanese spoken words pronunciation, which, given the word's meaning, was added to the corresponding Chinese character when it was brought over. In this sense, the kunyomi is derived from the word's meaning. It is usually used with single kanji words. The other type is onyomi, the borrowed Chinese pronunciations. In other words, the Chinese pronunciation that came along with the kanji each time it was brought over throughout history. Hence, there are often multiple onyomi, each corresponding to a different time period when it was brought over. In this sense, the onyomi is derived from the character's original sounds. It is usually used with compound kanji words. While China designates its citizens learn roughly 10,000 characters for regular use, Japanese government designates only 2,136 characters for common use as a literacy baseline. As Japanese people go through the school system, from primary to secondary, including elementary, middle, and high school, they gradually chip away at them. The common use kanji are those used in government documents, by news outlets, in business and magazines, in movie and TV show subtitles, and the like. Yet, not all kanji characters are used equally. The most frequent 100 make up about 40% of kanji use. 200, 50% of use. 500, 75% of use. And if you know only 1,000, less than half of the full list, you'll be able to recognize and understand 90% of the kanji out there in use. The remaining 1,000 get more and more specific and are less commonly used, if only rarely. As previously mentioned, each writing system tends to have its own distinct uses. While it will take a short bit of time to master hiragana and katakana, and many years for kanji, the combined use of the three different alphabets is not only natural and appropriate, but has a big advantage too. As Japanese doesn't use spaces in between words, if you only knew and used hiragana, which would be unnatural anyway, you'd end up with a sentence like this. Watashi no ha 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 wa ga suki desu. It's hard to know where words start and end, you might get a string of the same letter, and it becomes hard to read, if not impossible to understand. But when we naturally and appropriately use our alphabets, you'll get a nice sentence like this. Already, it's more aesthetically appeasing, with the variety of scripts and shapes. Watashi no haha wa Hawaii ga suki desu. While you'll gradually learn all these pieces over your first semester, it's now easier to see the nouns, particles, foreign word, adjective stem, and conjugation, and thus to grasp the overall meaning. After you've mastered hiragana and katakana, the more kanji you learn, the easier it will be to break down sentences and to improve your reading speed and comprehension. When it comes to pronunciations, especially vowels, Japanese is again a little different from English. While English vowels have a variety of pronunciations based on the word itself, where the vowel is in the word, regional dialect, etc., Japanese vowels are uniform and don't really change. Let's take a look and listen. Following the order of the Japanese sound chart, we'll start with ah, as in father, or the sound ah when you realize something. Next, what looks like the English I is in Japanese I, as in we, or the sound wee when you're going down a slide. Next is u, as in soup, or the sound ooh when you hear something you're fascinated, curious about. Next, what looks like the English e is in Japanese e, as in bed, or the sound eh when you hear something new, or something you're doubtful of. Eh? Lastly is o, as in old, or the sound oh when you're surprised or realize something. Overall, ah, oo, and o are pretty similar to English. It's just e and e that seem to be backwards. So make sure to pay attention to these when you see or hear them. Lastly, let's discuss the pyramid, inverted that is, a very useful concept to keep in mind as you learn. At the bottom is syntax and grammar. As a foundation, you need to know the sentence patterns, parts, and conjugations. While relatively smaller in comparison, they nonetheless form the foundation on which you'll grow. Above that is semantics and meaning. Once you know the patterns, parts, and conjugations, you need to know their meanings and nuances, what colors and hues they carry and convey, as well as the differences between them, which will help you choose which you want to use. At the top is pragmatics and usage. Once you know the grammar and what it means, the biggest part is knowing how to use everything and being able to use everything. The overall goal is not to speak English with Japanese words, but to speak Japanese in Japanese. So, you need to know, for instance, how a Japanese conversation flows and develops, the back and forth and progression of it. For instance, with interaction and information, English tends to take full steps forward, whereas Japanese tends to take half steps, gradually moving on. You also need to know norms, what's expected and what's appropriate, as well as the variations and deviations and their potential benefits and/or consequences. Ultimately, you need to know, with all your resources, including grammar, meaning, and usage, how to weave everything together in ways that allow you to express yourself and navigate your everyday life. In this presentation, we've gone over many social, cultural, and linguistic concepts and their interactions. And with that, you should now have a good foundation to start on your Japanese learning journey. Good luck! Ganbare!